Steady state runs, speed endurance, longer intervals, whatever you want to call these sessions, they are a key workout, especially for those of you that are running ultramarathons, marathons, and maybe even down to half marathon distance. So what are they and how can you implement them in your training plan? So what are steady state runs or speed endurance intervals, and how can you implement them in your training plan? Well, first off, to define them, I use the term steady state run or speed endurance. It's really referring to intervals that are anywhere probably between around 20 minutes up to 1 hour in duration. That is faster than your typical endurance run pace, your forever pace, the pace that you're planning to run your marathon or ultramarathon at. So you'll be looking at trying to maintain an effort level of around 7 out of 10 for the duration of that interval. So if it's a 20-minute interval, it's a 7 out of 10, with 10 out of 10 being as hard as you possibly go. If you use a heart rate based model that looks at lactate threshold, then you want to make sure that you're staying just below lactate threshold during these intervals. Those who follow the channel will know that I tend to use the Joe Friel 7-zone model for running for my heart rate intensity. So that would be running in zone 4 for those of you that are familiar with that model. And the purpose for these types of runs is really about working on your upper aerobic base fitness and aerobic speed. So essentially you're really trying to challenge how fast you can run using your aerobic capacity. So rather than going above lactate threshold, where you'll be looking at more your tempo runs. I did do a video on tempo runs, I'll put a link to that up there. But tempo runs, you're going at or slightly above lactate threshold and really developing your body's ability to utilize lactate. With these steady state runs, you're working at just below lactate threshold. So it's a speed faster than your forever pace, as I mentioned, but it's not as fast as going flat out as you would in, say, a tempo effort. The key for these as well is to make sure that you do a warm-up beforehand, because you are running at some intensity. So make sure you do dynamic stretching, some drills, and also maybe introduce a few accelerations as well prior to actually getting into the interval. In terms of implementing this in your plan, my usual approach is to use them in terms of, say, a dedicated session. So that session may be in the region of around 1 hour 30, 1 hour 45. And within that you may do 2x20, 2x25, 2x30 minute steady state run efforts, speed endurance efforts, separated with a 5-minute recovery period. However, for marathon training in particular, I also utilise them when in my long weekend runs. So I may do, say, a 2-3 hour long run, and within that I may have 2x30 minute steady state intervals in the middle of that. In terms of where to do them, location, it really is what you have available. On the trails is great if you're doing a trail race. Obviously on the road for road running. Just be conscious though, if you've got downhills, it can be difficult to maintain that sub-threshold heart rate, especially if there's technical descents where it may require you to slow down slightly. But ultimately, I would always try and replicate race conditions as much as possible. As I mentioned, these are working your aerobic engine, but you are still producing lactate at the intensity that you're doing, but your body should be able to process it. And a key distinction between these and your long runs is that these are a pace that you can't sustain for as long as your long run duration. An additional benefit of doing these sorts of runs is it's great for practicing your pacing, because if you go out too hard on a 30-minute effort, for example, you will find that your pace is dropping off by the end of that effort. So this is really about managing your pace, getting used to running at a pace faster than your forever pace. However, it's not going to be one that makes you slow down too much towards the end of that effort. So you really need to gauge how hard you're going at the start to make sure you can finish just as fast as you start off the run at. And by working these into your training plan, they're fantastic for building that speed endurance, because ultimately what the purpose of these runs is for is to increase your forever pace. So you're going to practice running at a pace slightly faster than that, and over time you'll increase the duration or the number of the steady state run intervals, the speed endurance intervals, and ultimately that will increase your overall long run pace. In terms of actually implementing these and putting them into a training plan, if it's for a marathon or an ultramarathon, I have these closer to the race, so it's more specific to the race, therefore I have them closer to the race. And it will be for a number of build weeks, and again I typically build up from say around 20 minutes, 25, 30 minutes, and also increase the number of repetitions. Typically I'll have a 5-minute recovery in between intervals, but you can also play around with the duration of the recovery period. For example, you may be running a 3-hour long run as part of your marathon training, so you may choose to do half an hour steady state run, a half-hour easy period, then another half-hour steady state run as you get more into the training session, so you're a bit more fatigued when you do that second steady state run, and that'll allow for some nice comparison between the two of them. Or you can stick with tried and tested around 1 hour 30, 1 hour 45 midweek run and just do them on those individual specific sessions. As I mentioned, I tend to put these towards the end of a training plan if it's for a long endurance event. So it could be that you initially start working on fast intensity intervals, so higher intensity intervals such as VO2 max, moving through to tempo runs before moving through to these speed endurance steady state run intervals. So that's how you can transition them into the plan. And when you finish your tempo runs, you might be doing say up to around 15 minutes per interval, then going up to 20 minutes. It's not a massive jump, however the speed that you will be running at will be slower, or the intensity will be lower than running at the tempo run where you're going to be going above lactate threshold. So that's something to bear in mind, but that's typically how I build them into plans. As I mentioned, because they're more specific and more similar to the sort of racing that the training plan is for, those long endurance events, I have them closer to the race rather than having them further away as base mileage early in a plan.
So those are my top tips for steady state runs. So for those of you that are doing longer races, I can highly recommend them. Just make sure you stay below lactate threshold. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. Also, if you go to my website, link below, you can fill in the form to receive my weekly newsletter with lots of training advice and top tips. And I'll see you next time.